And we begin in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And g'day. So good to see you, as today the Genesis 24 narrative gives us a tale as old as time. The love story between Isaac and Rebekah. But did you realise there is another love story? But if you look closely, you discover that the two main love interest story has overshadowed a pivotal character who ends up with a far more valuable love. And we will have a quick look at the start of chapter 24 to help fill us in on what's going on. Suddenly, Abraham realised time was getting away on him. Not only was he really old, Isaac should have been married with lots of children running around by now. And so he insists his servant takes an oath to get a wife for my son from his father's family. Now, as the servant plays a pivotal role in the narrative, who, as we will learn, also finds love, therefore we need to know a bit more about this character. Perhaps he is the servant from Genesis 15, 2-3, where God promises to bless Abram, and he responded by telling God, "What's the point? My servant Elijah of Damascus will inherit my estate." Even if the servant isn't Elijah, we can still be confident that the servant chosen for this vitally important mission was a senior trusted servant who had been with Abraham for a long time, and therefore the servant had witnessed the strong contrast between the way Abraham's faith in his God made him different to the surrounding people who always lived in fear of their God's awful religious demands. And it is a high possibility that this servant was one of the two trusted servants that had gone with Abraham and Isaac to the mountain, as Abraham would have taken servants that he trusted to not malign him if he returned without Isaac. And so he would have witnessed Abraham leave them behind looking old and weighed down with some hidden agony of spirit, and then witnessed the incredible change in Abraham and Isaac as they returned to them. There was this incredible light-filled joy and love radiating from their faces. Listening to their joy bubble over as they relived over and over God's miraculous provision of a ram at the last moment, had given the servant an increasing desire to know this God who does help his people. So he too could experience the same light of joy that Abraham and Isaac couldn't contain. And verse 5 blows my mind as the servant responds with, "What if I can't find a young woman who is willing to go back with me? Should your son go back to the land you came from?" Perhaps you have been told differently to me, but I am constantly hearing how the servants and women of the Bible were treated terrible. They had no rights. But firstly, from the servant's response, we can see that he was allowed to question his orders. And secondly, it is clear that there was this expectation that the young woman had the prerogative to say no, and her decision would be final. And from Abraham's reply, we can see that this was no hedging tactic on behalf of the servant to get out of the task. Abraham shows his abhorrence at the thought of Isaac returning to live with his family, bluntly informing the servant, "No way is Isaac to go back there. You must find a wife for my son from among my father's family." And if the woman is unwilling, Abraham was being very specific about who would be a suitable wife for his precious son. Even before it became law, it was clear that Abraham saw the dangers of an interfaith marriage. She couldn't be someone from Canaan who didn't know about their God of life and would be teaching the children in the ways of her gods of death. Whereas marrying a close relative meant she would have been taught about the God of life. The children would grow up being taught about God. And the servant got the message loud and clear. The woman had to consent, and under no circumstances was Isaac to go back to live with Nahor's family. And just in case the servant still had doubts about God coming through for him and was scared to come back home without a wife for Isaac, for it was not unheard of for a master to send a servant on an impossible mission and then kill him when he failed. And so Abraham reassures his servant with, "Then you were free of the oath you have made." Again, highlighting to the servant the difference between his gods, who didn't care about people, and so the people didn't care about each other. Whereas you could see that Abraham's God cared about his people in the way Abraham was kind and considerate towards those whom your culture considered inferior. But would such a great God allow him to have faith in him like Abraham did? And so he was confused when Abraham assured him that the Lord in whose presence I have lived will send his messenger ahead of you and will help you find a wife there for my son, making your mission successful. Abraham was trying to encourage the servant who didn't know God like he did to trust God to provide. Abraham was speaking with the confidence of someone who has lived long enough to experience time and time again that this is true. And of course, the last resounding time when God had rescued Isaac could leave no doubt in Abraham's mind that God will send his messenger with the servant. And being the good faithful servant he was, he packs a king's ransom on 10 camels and sets off on the strange mission to find a wife for Isaac. And while travelling by camel would make the journey quicker than when Abraham left his family to go to Canaan, he still had a good 2 weeks or more to wonder how he could trust Abraham's God to make it happen. And why would he? A servant who worshipped other gods? And possibly all too soon for the servant, who still couldn't figure out how Abraham's messenger would be willing to help an unbeliever like him. He arrived outside of Nahor's town towards evening, and he sets up camp beside a well, knowing that the women will soon be coming out to draw water. And while he still couldn't grasp that Abraham's God would help a lowly person like him, he knew Abraham was constantly praying to God. And so, thinking he had nothing to lose, he makes a deal with God, praying, "O Lord God of my master Abraham, please give me success on this mission. See, I'm standing beside this well. When a young woman comes to draw water, I will say to her, 'Please let me drink a little water from your jug.' And if she says, 'Drink, and I'll draw water for your camels too,' let her be the wife the Lord has chosen for my master's son." You gotta love the servant's growing fledgling faith. For the servant knew from hearing Abraham's prayers that in a situation like this, wishy-washy prayers wouldn't cut it. The prayers needed to be very specific. That way there could be no confusion as to whether God was answering the prayer with the right woman or not. And as the narrative informs us in verses 15 to 21, God was quick off the mark because before he finished praying in his heart, Rebekah came out with her jug on her shoulder. She went down to the spring and drew water. He said to her, "Please give me a drink." She quickly lowered her jar from her shoulder, saying, "Drink, and I'll water your camels too." So he drank, and she watered the camels also. The servant must have been in total awe of God's quick response to his private prayer, and how Rebekah had said and did everything exactly as he had asked God for. And then it must have been an even more incredible feeling for him when he discovered she was Nahor's granddaughter, for he had forgotten to ask God for a young woman from Abraham's family in his prayer. And yet God had met his, a lowly servant, unspoken prayer too. And later on, God affirms what the servant has witnessed by reminding his people in Isaiah chapter 65 verse 24 how I, God, will answer them before they even call to me. While they are still talking about their needs, I will go ahead and answer their prayers. And just look at the servant's response to God's incredibly quick provision with how he bowed down and worshipped the Lord, saying, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his kindness and faithfulness to my master. As for me, the Lord has led me on the journey to the house of my master's relatives." The servant is overflowing with joy because God had answered his humble prayer before he had even finished it. But he wasn't given time to really think about how quickly God had answered his prayer and Abraham's. For Rebekah had come back with her brother Laban, and the servant's head would have been in a whirl as he hears Laban say to him, "Come, you who are blessed by the Lord, why are you standing out here? I have prepared the house and a place for the camels." Laban had not only welcomed him, a servant, with open arms, he had spoken out loud exactly how he was feeling. How did Laban know he was feeling so blessed by God? What the servant wouldn't have known is that his face would have been full of the same love light he had seen in Abraham and Isaac's faces as he grasped how this God didn't just care and look out for the rich people like Abraham. This God was willing to help the lowly servants as well. And back at the house, when everything was organised and food was set before him, the servant couldn't eat. He had a mission to complete. And so he tells them how the Lord has blessed my master abundantly. Abraham is filthy rich, and my master's wife, Sarah, has borne him a son in her old age, and he has given him everything he owns. Now the servant is not trying to dazzle them with Abraham's wealth to entice Rebekah's family into allowing her to marry Isaac, for the servant was starting to see that Abraham's true riches was not in his great wealth, but in his treasured relationship with God. And that was more important to Abraham and Isaac, was that the woman also knew their God. And then the servant gives the family an almost word-to-word overview of what we have just looked at, only leaving out Abraham's aversion to Isaac going back to his family. And the servant finishes his dialogue with how, after Rebekah had told him that she was from Abraham's family, he had, as we heard earlier, bowed down and worshipped the Lord, praising God for leading me to the granddaughter of my master's brother. And yet, despite his growing faith and trusting God, the logical part of his brain still can't accept that God has really answered his prayers so quickly with Rebekah. Maybe he had rushed things. After all, he hadn't finished praying. What if God meant someone else? And to put a stop to the growing maybes and what ifs, the servant asks Laban, "Now if you will show kindness and faithfulness to my master, tell me. And if not, tell me, so I will know what to do next." And Laban and Bethuel didn't keep the servant in suspense as they answer together, "The Lord has brought you here. There is nothing we can say. Here is Rebekah. Take her and go. Let her become the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has directed." Was there simultaneous yes, due to the incredible wealthiness of Isaac, or a desire to please God? Or even more likely, this mixture of both, where they were both happy that God had provided such a rich husband for their daughter. But there can be no doubt about the servant's response to their answer. For verse 52 informs us that when Abraham's servant heard what they said, he bowed down to the ground and worshipped the Lord. Did you notice how the servant's faith has grown from silently watching and wondering about Abraham's interactions with God, having an increasing desire to know God, to privately praying, to quietly slipping into the conversation, his response to God's provision, and now publicly showing that he too worshipped in love and faith Abraham's God. And then the narrative explains how on the following morning the servant responds to their desire to spend 10 days farewelling Rebekah with, "Don't delay me. The Lord has made my mission successful. Send me back so I can return to my master." Naturally, the servant doesn't want to keep Abraham in suspense any longer than necessary. The good news of God's provision needs to be shared. And now, the family, conveniently remembering Rebekah's rights, reply with, "Let's call the girl and ask her opinion." Calling Rebekah, they asked her, "Will you go with this man?" She replied, "I will go." The servant must have breathed a sigh of relief at her firm, positive response, confirming that this was the woman God had chosen to be Isaac's wife. And we see that Rebekah's family had no hard feelings at her willingness to forego the cultural expectation of a 10 days farewell party, as they blessed Rebekah with, "Our sister, may you become thousands upon 10,000. May your descendants possess the gates of their enemies." Did you find it interesting how their wording mirrors what God had told Abram when he had told him to head to Canaan? Had Abram told them what God said? And so despite there being only Isaac to fulfill the promise, they too clung to the hope that God's promise would come true, and through Isaac and Rebekah's children there would come a people beyond counting. Again, confirming to the servant that God had answered his prayer. And as we modern people know, God's promise to Abraham came true, beyond even his wildest expectations. The Apostle Paul explains to new Christians in Romans and Galatians how people who believe in Jesus are added to the family of faith, with Romans chapter 4 verse 16 telling us that the promise is received by faith, a free gift of grace, if we have faith like Abraham's. For Abraham is the father of all who believe. And with the incredible blessing of her descendants being beyond counting, ringing in her ears, Rebekah heads off with the servant into the unknown. She is going into a different culture to marry a man she has never met. She has heard lots of good things about Abraham from the family talks around the table, and so would be pinning her hopes that the son would be like his father. And during the journey, the servant would have told her about Isaac's incredible rescue by God and other details about his personality. And this helped her know Isaac's faith and what he is like as a person. But the narrative switches the scene from Rebekah and the servant to Isaac, informing how, in the meantime, Isaac had come from Beer-lahai-roi, for he was living in the Negev. In the early evening, Isaac went out to the field to meditate, and as he looked up, he saw camels approaching. And in those few words, we get this lovely picture of Isaac's faith in God, where he would go out and spend time with God. The closet romantic in me wonders whether this particular evening, he was questioning God as to what sort of wife he had in mind for him. At the same time, knowing God would have the servant find the right woman for him. And how much longer would he have to wait to see her? The waiting seemed like forever, and it was killing him. And so when he saw the camels in the distance, he looked up, hoping that finally the suspense would be over and he would meet the woman God had chosen for him. And then the narrative rivals any love story, as we are told, Rebekah looked up and saw Isaac. She got down from her camel, asking the servant, "Who is that man in the field coming to meet us?" The servant replied, "He is my master." So she took a veil and covered herself. You can decide for yourself whether their eyes met and it was love at first sight or not, for their reaction to meeting each other is not important to the narrative. It is their willingness to be faithful and trust in God's will for their lives. And then the servant, who has been faithful to his master, tells Isaac everything he has done. Isaac brought her into his mother's tent. Rebekah became his wife. Isaac loved her and was comforted after his mother's death. And just like last week, the narrative takes the reader from the drama of finding a suitable wife, and rather than having them ride off in love into the sunset, concludes with Isaac and Rebekah returning to normal life as a married couple with its everyday ups and downs. And while we go, at the lovely love story of Isaac and Rebekah, let's remember that in Scripture's narratives, giving the history of the development of the nation, there is a faith narrative running alongside the historical facts. And so in God's eyes, there was an even better love story happening. For as good and wonderful as Isaac, Rebekah falling in love at first sight is, in God's eyes, this unnamed servant is the main character. God considers the unnamed servant whose growing interest in Abraham's God had led him to trust him through his specific prayer to provide for Abraham. And then his joyful response of praise and worship coming from a heart that now believes in God is a far greater love story than even Isaac and Rebekah's. And so we modern people can take heart from the servant's slowly growing love for God, that God is supremely interested in our growing love for him. And also, as our love for God grows, that we can be like Abraham and show those around us our genuine love for God, so that they, like the servant, will desire to know God for themselves. Amen.